Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. Yeah, you know those words. And to be frank, almost everyone does. You have probably felt something when you heard them if you were an adult then, because I was 18, 1997, so I can't remember them properly. But if you heard them, you probably felt something that made you think, yes, that's me, that's who I am. And that specific feeling, it's an intimate feeling of recognition, is exactly what Apple needed you to have in September 1997. Because they were 90 days from bankruptcy and they needed you to believe a story before you looked at the numbers. Hello everyone, I'm MAHY-MA-SOMGA. This is The Real Story. We're talking about narrative equity. Today we're going inside the most effective piece of financial engineering ever disguised as an advertisement. What was actually happening? September 1997. Let me tell you what Apple looked like, inside Apple, what they looked like at the time. The company had lost over $1 billion that fiscal year. The stock option had dropped 80% since 1992. The retailers were cutting shelf space for Apple product because there was no point stocking a brand that nobody was buying anymore. 3,800 employees had been laid off. 3,800 employees have been laid off. The product line was so bloated and confused that even people inside the company could not explain what Apple made or who it was for. There was an Apple Newton. The Apple Newton was a personal digital assistant that did not work. It was another thing that they created, the pipe-in. It was a gaming console that nobody really wanted, nobody asked for. There was a line of Macintosh clones that were actively cannibalizing the brand. At that time, Steve Jobs had just come back. He came back because Apple had acquired his company next and he would come along with the deal. He wasn't even the CEO yet. He was interim CEO. And they call him ICEO. The I standing for interim, which tells you everything about how certain anyone was that this was going to work. And in this context, they had 90 days of cash left, $1 billion loss, a very confused product line, a workforce that had watched thousands of colleagues get low. Steve Jobs walked into a meeting with an advertising agency and said, okay, we need a campaign for the idea of Apple. And he really emphasized on the idea, and the campaign they made did not show a single product. It was just black and white photograph of Albert Einstein, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Picasso, Muhammad Ali, Amelia Earhart, and a voiceover that says, here's to the crazy ones. The voiceovers that I read in the opening. From a net loss of over $1 billion in 1997, Apple registers a profit of $309 million the following year. The campaign is credited with saving the company, but not for the reason that the official story tells you. At least is what I think. The official story goes like this. Steve Jobs returned to Apple. He was a visionary genius. He saw that the company had lost its soul. So what he did is he relaunched the brand around values instead of product, inspired the world, saved the company, and built it into the most valuable business in human history, basically. That's the official story, and it's a great story. That's the kind of story that gets told in business schools and in biography because it's what you want, right? It's like the hero lives, the hero returns, and the hero wins. Almost every element of it is true. It's true that Steve Jobs returned. That's true that the campaign was about values and not product. And it's true that Apple did recover from a very, very bad position. What the official stories leaves out is the sequence of events. what had to happen before the values could mean anything? Because Think Different, the name of the campaign, was not a vision statement. It was very specific. It was a very deliberate piece of psychological maneuvering that the company deployed at the exact moment when the alternative was collapse. So let me show you what that means. So before Think Different, before the crazy ones, etc., Steve Jobs did something that nobody puts in the inspirational version of this story. He called Microsoft. Apple market share in 1997 was somewhere between 3 and 5%. Microsoft owned the rest. So literally owned the rest. Bill Gates was the bad guy, the villain in every Apple narrative that ever existed. The two companies had been in open warfare for over a decade, and Steve Jobs quietly negotiated a $150 million investment from Microsoft in exchange for making Internet Explorer the default browser on every Mac. Okay, so think of it. You have a Macintosh, and the default browser to go on the internet at that time when everyone was using it was like the internet boom, right? The .com era. He put as a default browser the Microsoft one. So Microsoft invested $150 million in Apple and committed to supporting Microsoft Office for Mac, stabilizing the company and giving it the breathing room to innovate. So he announced that at Macworld 1997. So the audience was like pretty upset, right? They booed at him, they literally booed at him because in every official Apple story and communication, Microsoft was the enemy, and Steve Jobs had just taken their money. So he also cut 70% of Apple's product line. Good. Including the Apple Newton, which he had personally hated since even before he left the company. So he ended the clone program also. He simplified everything down to 4 products: a desktop and a laptop for professional and consumers. That was it. By doing so, he stabilized the finances. He simplified the operation and he bought himself time. That's the real smart move. He bought himself time. And only then he launched Think Different. The sequence matters because Think Different wasn't the strategy, it was the surface of the strategy. The real strategy was survive long enough for the story to work. So here's the thing about Think Different that I find really interesting and genuinely fascinating. So as we said, he didn't mention computers. He didn't mention Apple product at all beyond the logo at the end. It featured people who were dead, who had never used an Apple product. And in several cases, they lived before computer even existed. Einstein, Gandhi, Martha Graham, Amelia Earhart, they didn't even meet a computer in their life. What he was selling was an identity. Specifically, your identity, the person watching the ads. The psychological mechanism at work here is something that researchers call, they call it identity-based motivation. It's a theory that is developed by a woman called Daphne Oyselman, I hope I'm saying the name correctly, at USC, at the University of Southern California. And the theory is that humans are powerfully driven to act in ways that are consistent with who they believe they are. Not who they want to be, but who they believe they already are. So Think Different didn't say Apple makes great computers. It said you are the kind of person who thinks differently. You are the misfits. You are the rebel, the round peg. And by the way, here's the object that people like you use. It sold you your own self-image, and then he attached Apple to that self-image so completely that buying a competitor's product started to feel like a betrayal of who you were. That is identity engineering, and it worked. It worked not just for the reason because it was true, but because most people bought a Mac in 1998 because it gave people a story about themselves that felt good to believe. And once you are inside someone else's self-narrative, you are extraordinarily difficult to move. And there is a detail, something something that is important to talk about. And the official story never talks about it. Steve Jobs did not write it. The famous Think Different line and the brilliant concept of putting the line together with black and white photograph of time-honored visionaries, etc. It was invented by a creative person at the advertising agency. The advertising agency was TBWA, Chad and Day. The person who invented that is a copywriter named Craig Tanimoto, and he came up with the slogan. Then a creative director named Rob Siltanen wrote the script for Here's to the Crazy Ones. And he wrote the script overnight. Jobs initially called the script, and I'm quoting here directly, shit. Then he came around, he edited it, and he was deeply involved. I'm not minimizing Steve Jobs' job at all. But the origin story, the ones where Jobs had a vision and translated it into an ad, is a version of events that conveniently serves the larger myth. The myth where Jobs is the sole author of Apple's resurrection. Everyone says the visionary who saw what nobody else could see. Well, that real story is messier and more interesting because the company 90 days from bankruptcy, the fact that he's making a deal with the enemy, the overnight script written by someone whose name almost nobody knows. That's not a lesser story. That's a more human story. I think it's a truer story, and you know it raises a question we're sitting with. We built the Steve Jobs myth completely. That we made it impossible to learn the actual lessons, which is that Apple in 1997 was saved by a series of unglamorous decisions made under extreme pressure, followed by a piece of communication so precisely targeted at human psychology that it made people feel something true about themselves using images of people who had nothing to do with computers. So the vision was real, and the fact that Steve Jobs is a visionary is real. But the execution was collaborative. The execution was pragmatic. And he probably felt occasionally desperate at the time. That's the real story of Think Different. A story of survival dressed as inspiration, about financial engineering that they dressed as philosophy. It's a story about a company that needed you to believe in its identity before it had fully figured out what that identity was. So here's what I keep coming back to. Think Different, the crazy ones had worked. And Apple went from 90 days of cash to the most valuable company on earth. And the campaign is studied in every single business school. And it deserves to be, right? But the story we told about why it worked, that story served a purpose too. It gave us a narrative simple enough to repeat. And in making that story simple, we lost the actual listen, which is that the gap between a company's public narrative and its private reality is almost always where the real intelligence lives. Steve Jobs didn't save Apple by thinking differently, but he saved Apple by thinking extremely clearly about money, about time, about human psychology, and about what people needed to believe before they had give Apple another chance. Steve Jobs understood that the story had to come before the proof, that you could not wait until the product were great to tell Apple was great. You had to make them believe, them believe it first, right? And then build the product that confirmed what they already believed. So that sequence, narrative before proof, identity before product, is the real thing that happened in 1997 and was never just the ad. This is the real story at Narrative Equity. I'm MAHY-MA-SOMGA. Thank you. I will see you next time. Our next episode will be the hustle culture movement. The official story is a generation embracing hard work, but the real story is like we rebranded anxiety as a virtue because it was easier than admitting we were scared.